Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Next up, we'll have a presentation from the report's Chief Scientific Editor, Anne Olhoff. Over to you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keisha. And let's go straight to the next slide. So the key focus of this year's emissions gap report is on the new nationally determined contributions. 39 leading scientists from 21 institutions across 16 countries contributed to the report this year. The production of the report was overseen by an international steering committee. It's gone through external expert review, and the governments of the countries specifically mentioned in the report were offered the opportunity to comment on the preliminary findings pertaining to their countries as usual. Next slide, please. As this figure shows, global greenhouse gas emissions continued to increase in 2024, reaching a new record of 57.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. This represented a 2.3% increase from 2023 levels. And as the figure shows, the increase occurred in all categories of greenhouse gases, and it also occurred across all major sectors. Even though fossil fuels account for about 69% of global emissions and are the key driver of total emissions, deforestation and land use change was decisive for the rapid increase in 2024 emissions. Next slide, please. Despite the Paris Agreement requirement to submit new NDCs by February this year, only about 1/3 of parties had done so by the cutoff date for this report of 30th of September. For the emissions and temperature projections of this report, we zoom in on the 60 parties covering about 63% of global greenhouse gas emissions that had either submitted or announced a new NDC target containing a greenhouse gas mitigation target for 2035 by the 30th of September. And these include the 7 G20 members that you see on the screen that had submitted a new NDC target by this date, and also the 3 members that had announced such targets through high-level statements of intent by the 30th of September. For parties that have not yet submitted a new NDC, the report assumes a continuation of current policy trends. All the new NDC mitigation targets of the G20 members imply progress in terms of reducing emissions in 2035 beyond emissions associated with the NDC targets for 2030. Next slide, please. To assess whether the new NDCs of the G20 represent increased mitigation ambition beyond what would result from policies already in place, this figure compares G20 emissions in 2035 with those expected under current policies. In total, the new NDC targets by G20 members are estimated to result in emissions in 2035 that are about 2.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents lower than those under current policy projections. And this estimate increases to 3.6 gigatons of CO2 equivalents when expanded to cover the G20 as a group. You can also see that these estimates include the NDC of the United States of America, which will only remain active until the US leaves the Paris Agreement. And as shown in the figure, the exclusion of the NDC of the US and the updated current policy projections have a significant implication for the estimates. Next slide, please. Let's then look at the emissions gap, the gap between global emissions in 2035 resulting from the full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs and the levels consistent with below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees pathways has narrowed compared with last year's assessment. But as the figure also shows, it remains large. The full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs reduces expected emissions in 2035 by about 12 and 15% respectively compared with 2019 levels. But these reductions are far smaller than the 35 and 55% reductions needed to align with 2 degrees and 1.5 degree pathways. Next slide, please. This also means that although the temperature projections are about 0.3% degrees lower than in last year's assessment, as also pointed out by the Executive Director, they remain far above the goal of the Paris Agreement. The temperature projections shown on the slide highlight the significance of immediate action and of credible net zero plans and their implementation. As you can see from the slide, there's almost a 1 degree difference between projections based on current policies, which point to global warming of up to 2.8 degrees over this century, and those that are based on the most optimistic pledge-based scenario included in the report, which assumes the full implementation of both the conditional NDCs and the full achievement of all net zero pledges. This would limit global warming to 1.9 degrees of Celsius over this century. Next slide, please. Due to the continued delay in deep emissions cuts, exceedance of 1.5 degrees of global warming is approaching, and 1.5 degree pathways now imply higher temporary overshoot of this temperature limit. However, this merely stresses the need for immediate and unprecedented levels of mitigation to limit the magnitude and the duration of overshoot to the lowest possible level, thereby also minimizing the increased reliance on uncertain, risky, and costly carbon dioxide removal methods in the future. Every fraction of a degree of global warming avoided matters. It limits the escalation of risks, damages, losses, and adverse health impacts that are already being experienced today and which hit the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. It also lowers the risk of irrevocable impacts and of triggering climate tipping points that would lead to abrupt and irreversible climate changes. Next slide, please. The good news is that there has been significant progress made since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and that opportunities for accelerating climate action and ambition abound. Global warming projections based on policy projections as well as on NDC projections have dropped by about 1 degree Celsius since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. We now have net zero emission pledges that cover about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, renewable energy technologies have undergone a transformation and continue to exceed even the most optimistic projections. So the solutions needed to course correct are available. They're available at low cost, and they can deliver stronger economic growth, better human health, more jobs, energy security, and resilience. This means that the international community is now in a far better position to accelerate climate ambition and action than a decade ago. And as this report emphasizes, such acceleration is critical. Next slide, please. Let me end by thanking you on behalf of the authors, the steering committee members, and the entire production team of the report. Thank you, and back to you, Keisha.
Thank you very much, Anne. So that wraps up the